There is an old saying in our industry that I have heard repeated in every green room, every investor meeting, and every opening night party I have ever attended. It goes like this: you can't make a living on Broadway, but you can make a killing. That single sentence contains more truth about the economics of live theater than most textbooks. It captures the paradox that every Broadway producer lives inside: the overwhelming probability of failure and the tantalizing possibility of extraordinary success. It is a business where roughly 80% of shows lose money, a statistic that has remained stubbornly unchanged since at least the 1960s. And yet, every season, producers like me line up to make the next bet, to write the next check, to believe in the next story. Why? Because when you get it right, when the material, the creative team, the timing, and the audience all align, there is no feeling in the world like it. And no return on investment quite like it either. I am Sue Gilad, and this is Curtain Call Conversations. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most misunderstood and least discussed aspects of Broadway: the art and science of producing. How do you decide which shows to back? What do you look for in a script, a creative team, a concept? How do you balance instinct with analysis? And what do you learn from the shows that do not reach their potential? This episode is for anyone who has ever made a decision under uncertainty. Which is to say, this episode is for everyone. Before we talk about instinct and artistry, let us start with the numbers. Because if you are going to understand how a Broadway producer thinks, you need to understand the financial landscape we operate in. The 2024-25 Broadway season just set a record. According to the Broadway League, shows grossed $1.89 billion and drew 14.7 million audience members, making it the highest-grossing season in Broadway's recorded history. 77 productions played a combined 13,404 performances, and audiences filled 91.2% of available seats. Those numbers sound extraordinary, and they are. But here is what those numbers do not tell you. Of the 43 productions that opened during that record-breaking season, 21 musicals, 21 plays, and 1 special engagement, the vast majority will never return a dollar to their investors. The recoupment rate for Broadway musicals over the past 5 years, according to producer Ken Davenport's analysis, is 20.45%, 1 in 5. And that number, as Davenport himself has noted, is the same dang number it has been for decades. So let me put that in perspective. If you invested in 5 Broadway musicals this season, statistically, 4 of them would lose your entire investment. All of it, gone. And the 5th, if you are fortunate, might make it back and then some. Now let me tell you what it costs to place those bets. A new Broadway musical today typically requires between $12 and $25 million in capitalization. That is the total investment needed before a single paying audience member walks through the door. Some shows cost significantly more. The most expensive musical to arrive on Broadway in recent years carried a capitalization of $31.5 million. And the infamous Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, which opened in 2011, cost an estimated $75 million and became one of the most cautionary tales in Broadway history. But the capitalization is just the beginning. Once your show is running, you face weekly operating costs. For a major Broadway musical, fixed costs alone, salaries for cast,
crew, musicians, stage managers, marketing, insurance, general management typically run between $650,000 and $800,000 per week. On top of that, the theater charges rent, usually 6 to 7% of your gross weekly box office receipts. And then there are royalties to the creative team, the writers, director, choreographer, designers, which typically consume around 40% of weekly operating profits.
So every single week, before a producer can think about paying back investors, hundreds of thousands of dollars are walking out the door. And if your show does not sell enough tickets to cover those costs, there is something called a stop clause. If your box office gross falls below a set threshold for 2 consecutive weeks, either the theater owner or the producers can close the show. 2 weeks. That is how fast a Broadway dream can end. Now, here's the other side of that equation, the side that keeps every producer in the game. When a show works, when it truly works, the returns can be staggering. Early investors in Wicked have seen returns approaching 4,000%. The Lion King has grossed over $1.7 billion on Broadway alone, a record. Hamilton became not just a cultural phenomenon, but a financial one, generating returns that most hedge fund managers would envy. The Book of Mormon recouped its entire investment in just 9 months. And here is the critical insight. The upside on Broadway is theoretically unlimited. A show can run for years, decades. The Phantom of the Opera ran for 35 years. And beyond the Broadway run, there are national tours, international productions, licensing to schools and community theaters, film adaptations, streaming deals. These subsidiary rights can generate revenue for years, sometimes decades, after the Broadway curtain falls for the last time. This is what makes Broadway economics look remarkably similar to another high-risk, high-reward industry, venture capital. In venture capital, roughly 75 to 90% of investments fail, depending on how you define failure. The math works because the rare successes, the Googles, the Amazons, generate returns so massive that they cover all the losses and then some. Broadway operates on the same principle. You are not trying to avoid failure entirely. You are trying to find the one show that changes everything. Jason Lax, the president of the Broadway League, captured the current moment perfectly when he said, and I am quoting him directly, "With rising costs hitting every facet of production, it is becoming harder and harder to bring live theater to the stage. Shows today have an ever shorter window to get on their feet. That is the environment every Broadway producer operates in today. The stakes have never been higher, the margins have never been thinner, and the decisions have never been more consequential." So how do you make those decisions? How do you look at a script, a concept, a creative team, and decide to bet millions of dollars that this particular combination of talent and story will move 1,000 strangers to their feet 8 times a week? That is what the rest of this episode is about. Every Broadway show begins the same way. Somebody has an idea. But the distance between an idea and an opening night curtain is measured in years, often 5 to 10 years, sometimes longer. And at every stage of that journey, a producer is making decisions, evaluating, assessing, deciding whether to keep investing time, money, and reputation, or to walk away. Let me walk you through the pipeline, because understanding the development process is essential to understanding how producers think. The first stage is the reading. This is the simplest and least expensive form of development. A group of actors sits around a table and reads the script aloud, usually with minimal staging. The purpose is to hear the words, to discover whether the story works when it leaves the page and enters the air. For a musical, there might be a piano accompaniment, but nothing more. A reading can cost as little as a few $1,000s, and it tells you an enormous amount. You can hear where the audience laughs, where they lean forward, where they check their phones. If the reading shows promise, the next step is typically a workshop. This is a more substantial investment, usually involving several weeks of rehearsal, a small ensemble, basic staging, and sometimes rudimentary costumes and set pieces. Workshops can cost anywhere from $50,000 to several $100,000. This is where you begin to see the show as a three-dimensional experience rather than words on a page. And this is where many of the most critical creative decisions are made. Does the second act work? Is the protagonist compelling enough? Does the score land emotionally? After the workshop, some shows move to an out-of-town tryout, a full production at a regional theater, often in cities like Washington, D.C., Boston, or Chicago. This is a major commitment, both financially and creatively. An out-of-town tryout can cost millions, but it provides something invaluable, a real audience in a real theater for multiple weeks. You can see what works, what does not, and, crucially, whether the show has the stamina to sustain an 8-show-a-week schedule. And then, finally, if everything aligns, the show moves to Broadway. Previews begin, typically 3 to 6 weeks of performances before paying audiences, during which the creative team continues to refine. And then, opening night arrives. The critics come, the reviews are published, and in a matter of hours, the trajectory of a multi-million-dollar investment can be fundamentally altered. Here is what I want you to understand about this process. At every single stage, a producer is making a bet. A reading costs relatively little, but it costs time and attention, and in this business, those are finite resources. A workshop costs real money. An out-of-town tryout costs serious money, and by the time you reach Broadway, you have committed everything. The skill of producing is not just about picking winners. It is about knowing when to advance, when to pause, and when to walk away. It is about managing a portfolio of risk across time. People ask me all the time, what do you look for in a show? And I understand why they ask, because from the outside, producing can look like pure intuition, like some mysterious ability to predict what audiences will love. But the truth is both simpler and more complicated than that. Let me share the framework I have developed over years of producing and co-producing Broadway shows. It is not a formula. There is no formula in this business. But it is a set of questions I ask myself every time I consider a new project. The first question is about the story itself. Does this story need to be told on a stage? Not on a screen, not in a book. On a stage, in front of a live audience, in real time. Because here is the thing about Broadway. It is the most expensive storytelling medium in the world. If a story can be told just as effectively as a film or a television series, then it probably should be. The stories that belong on Broadway are the ones that are fundamentally transformed by the live experience, by the shared breath of the audience, by the electricity of human beings performing extraordinary feats of talent and vulnerability just feet away from you. Tony Award-winning producer Barbara Whitman has articulated this beautifully. She says she looks for something unique about the live experience that can't be replicated on film or television. I could not agree more. The second question is about the creative team. Who is telling this story, and do they have the vision and the skill to realize it at the highest level? A study from Columbia University examined what they called the myth of the A-list creative team. The assumption that assembling the most commercially successful writers, directors, and choreographers guarantees success. What they found was more nuanced. Past commercial success is not the strongest predictor. What matters most is getting the right director, someone whose artistic sensibility is genuinely aligned with the material. A brilliant director working on the wrong show can be just as problematic as a mediocre director working on any show. Let me give you a concrete example from my own experience. When I came on board The Outsiders as a producer, one of the elements that excited me most was the creative team. Danya Taymor was directing, and she brought a visceral, kinetic energy to the material that felt absolutely right for a story about young people fighting for their place in the world. The music by Jamestown Revival, Jonathan Clay and Zach Chance, brought an authentic, raw Americana sound that honored the Oklahoma roots of S.E. Hinton's novel. And Adam Rapp, working with Justin Levine on the book, understood that this was not just a coming-of-age story, but a story about class, about belonging, about what it means to be an outsider in a world that has already decided who you are. That alignment between material, director, composers, and book writer is what I look for. Not the biggest names, the right names. The third question is about the audience. Who is this show for, and will they come? This is where commerce meets creativity, and it is a question that every honest producer must grapple with. You can love a piece of material with your whole heart, but if you cannot identify an audience that will pay Broadway prices to see it 8 times a week, you have a problem. This does not mean pandering. Some of the most commercially successful shows in Broadway history were considered risky or unconventional when they were first proposed. Hamilton, a hip-hop musical about the Founding Fathers. Wicked, a revisionist prequel to The Wizard of Oz, told from the villain's perspective. These were not safe bets, but their producers could articulate who the audience was and why they would come. The fourth question, and this is one that is increasingly important, is about longevity. Does this show have what the industry calls tourable DNA? Can it work outside of New York? Can it travel to London, to Asia, to Australia? Can it be licensed to regional theaters and schools? Because in today's economics, a show that only works on Broadway is a much riskier proposition than a show that can generate revenue across multiple platforms and markets for years to come. The Outsiders is a perfect example of this thinking. S.E. Hinton's novel has been read by millions of people around the world. Francis Ford Coppola's film adaptation is a cultural touchstone. The story has built-in recognition that transcends geography. When we were evaluating the show's potential, the question was never, will people know what this is? The question was, can we honor this beloved material in a way that justifies the Broadway stage? And the answer, as it turned out, was yes. The show recouped its $22 million investment in 20 months. It is now on a North American tour that launched in Tulsa, the very city where the story is set. And productions are planned for London's West End, Asia, and Australia. That is what tourable DNA looks like. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That framework sounds rational and systematic, but isn't producing really about gut feeling? Don't you just know when a show is going to work? The honest answer is yes and no. And the science behind that answer is fascinating. In 1974, 2 psychologists named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper in the journal Science called Judgment Under Uncertainty: Heuristics and Biases. It has been cited nearly 60,000 times, making it one of the most influential papers in the history of social science. What Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated was that human beings, including experts, rely on mental shortcuts when making decisions under uncertainty. These shortcuts, which they called heuristics, are often useful, but they can also lead to systematic errors, biases that distort our judgment in predictable ways. Kahneman later expanded this work in his best-selling book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, where he described two systems of thought. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. It is the part of your brain that recognizes a face or finishes a familiar phrase. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and analytical. It is the part that solves a complex math problem or weighs the pros and cons of a major decision. Here is what is relevant for producing. When a producer reads a script and feels something, that electric charge of excitement, that certainty that this is special, that is System 1 at work. It is pattern recognition operating below the level of conscious analysis, and it can be extraordinarily valuable. But, and this is a critical but, another researcher named Gary Klein spent decades studying how experts actually make decisions in high-pressure situations. He studied firefighters, military commanders, intensive care nurses, people who must make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no time for lengthy analysis. What Klein discovered was a process he called recognition-primed decision-making. Experts, he found, do not typically compare multiple options analytically. Instead, they recognize patterns from their accumulated experience and mentally simulate how a course of action will play out. If the simulation works, they act. If it does not, they modify and simulate again. This is what experienced producers do. When I read a script and feel that charge of excitement, it is not magic. It is the product of years of experience, of having read hundreds of scripts, attended thousands of performances, watched audiences respond to every conceivable type of material. My System 1 has been trained by decades of data, even if that data is not organized in a spreadsheet. But here is where it gets really interesting. In 2009, Kahneman and Klein, who had spent years on opposite sides of the debate about expert intuition, published a joint paper in The American Psychologist called Conditions for Intuitive Expertise, a Failure to Disagree. They found common ground. Expert intuition, they agreed, is reliable only in environments that are sufficiently regular, meaning there are stable patterns that can be learned through experience, and where the expert has had adequate opportunity to learn those patterns through practice and feedback. Broadway producing is a fascinating test case for this framework. On one hand, there are patterns. Certain types of stories tend to resonate. Certain creative team configurations tend to produce better results. The relationship between critical reception and box office performance follows somewhat predictable trajectories. On the other hand, every show is unique. The cultural moment is always shifting. Audience tastes evolve. And the variables are so numerous: the script, the score, the performances, the design, the marketing, the reviews, the weather on opening night, that no amount of pattern recognition can eliminate uncertainty. This is why the best producers combine both systems. They trust their intuition, their System 1, but they also subject it to rigorous System 2 analysis. They ask, why do I feel excited about this? What specifically about this material, this team, this concept is triggering my pattern recognition? And are there any biases? Confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, the availability heuristic that might be distorting my judgment? Malcolm Gladwell explored a related idea in his book Blink, where he described the phenomenon of thin slicing, the ability to make accurate judgments from very limited information. But Gladwell was careful to note that thin slicing works best when it is grounded in genuine expertise. An art expert can spot a forgery in seconds because they have spent a lifetime studying authentic works. A Broadway producer can sense a hit because they have spent a career immersed in the ecosystem of live theater. The gut feeling is real, but it is not a substitute for expertise. It is a product of it. Every producer has a portfolio, And like any portfolio, it contains both successes and lessons. I want to talk about both because I believe you learn as much, maybe more, from the shows that do not reach their potential as you do from the ones that exceed all expectations. Let me start with what success looks like, because I think people outside the industry often misunderstand it. I co-produced Moulin Rouge, the musical, which opened on Broadway in July of 2019. The show was capitalized at $28 million, a significant investment by any measure. It won 10 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. It recouped its entire capitalization by November of 2022, and it ran for nearly 7 years at the Al Hirschfeld Theater, becoming one of the defining productions of its era. Now, from the outside, that looks like an obvious success, a sure thing. But I can tell you that nothing about it felt obvious or sure at the time. Jukebox musicals, shows built around existing popular songs, have a mixed track record on Broadway. For every Mamma Mia, there is a show that audiences simply did not embrace. The question with Moulin Rouge was always, can you take 70-plus pop songs spanning decades of music and weave them into a coherent emotional narrative? Can you honor Baz Luhrmann's iconic film while creating something that is distinctly theatrical? Can you justify a $28 million investment on a concept that some people dismissed as a glorified medley? The answer, as it turned out, was yes, but only because the creative team found a way to make the music serve the story rather than the other way around. Every song choice had to earn its place dramatically, and the immersive design of the production, transforming the Hirschfeld Theater into the Moulin Rouge nightclub itself, created an experience that simply could not be replicated on screen. That is the kind of creative alchemy that no spreadsheet can predict. Buena Vista Social Club is another instructive example. I co-produced this show, which opened on Broadway in March of 2025. It earned 10 Tony nominations, tied for the most that season, and won a special Tony Award for the extraordinary musicians who perform live on stage every night, as well as best orchestrations. The audience response has been remarkable. People describe it as joyous, moving, nostalgic, and unlike anything else on Broadway. But what drew me to this project was something specific: the music itself. The original Buena Vista Social Club album won a Grammy Award and introduced the world to the extraordinary musicians of pre-revolutionary Havana. The story of young artists creating a sound that shakes the world only to have revolution change everything, and then rediscovering their music decades later, is inherently dramatic. It has built-in emotional stakes, and the music is so infectious, so alive, that you can feel the audience's energy shift the moment the first notes are played. What Buena Vista Social Club demonstrates is something I look for in every project: an emotional engine. Every great show has one. It is the thing that makes an audience lean forward, that makes them feel something they did not expect to feel. In Buena Vista Social Club, that engine is the music, not as background, but as the living, breathing heart of the story. Now let me talk about the other side. Because the truth is, not every show reaches its potential, and in this industry, the reasons are as varied as the shows themselves. Sometimes the material is strong, but the timing is wrong. A show that would have been a sensation 5 years earlier or 5 years later opens into a cultural moment that is simply not receptive. Sometimes the creative team is talented but misaligned, a director whose sensibility does not quite match the material, or a score that is beautiful in isolation but does not serve the dramatic needs of the story. Sometimes the marketing fails to communicate what the show actually is, and audiences arrive with expectations that the production cannot meet.
And sometimes, and this is the hardest lesson, everything is good. The material is strong, the team is talented, the execution is solid, and the audience simply does not come in sufficient numbers. There is no single identifiable reason. The show just does not catch fire. This is the reality that every producer must make peace with. You can do everything right and still not succeed. You can make the best possible decisions with the information available and still lose your investment. That is not a failure of judgment. That is the nature of the enterprise. The question is not, how do I avoid failure? The question is, how do I learn from every experience, success and disappointment alike, and bring that learning to the next decision?
I want to make a connection that I think is important because it extends the relevance of this conversation far beyond Broadway. A Broadway producer is fundamentally an entrepreneur. We identify opportunities, we raise capital, we assemble teams, we manage risk, we make decisions with incomplete information under time pressure, and we live with the consequences, financial, professional, and personal, of those decisions. Forbes magazine published an article titled, "What Founders Can Learn from a Tony Award-Winning Producer," and the parallels they identified are striking. Like a startup founder, a Broadway producer must find the product, the show, and then convince investors to fund it. Like a founder, a producer must build a team of extraordinary talent and create the conditions for that talent to do its best work. Like a founder, a producer must navigate the tension between creative vision and commercial viability. But there is one crucial difference between Broadway and Silicon Valley, and it is a difference that makes our industry uniquely unforgiving. In the startup world, you can pivot. If your initial product does not find a market, you can change direction. You can iterate. You can release a minimum viable product and improve it based on user feedback over months or years. Broadway does not work that way. Once your show opens, the product is essentially fixed. You can make adjustments during previews, you can refine the marketing, you can adjust ticket pricing, but the fundamental creative product, the script, the score, the performances, the design, is what it is. There is no version 2.0, there is no pivot. This means that the decisions you make during development, the years of readings, workshops, and tryouts that precede opening night, are the most consequential decisions in the entire process. By the time the curtain goes up, you have already placed your bet. The cards are on the table. The financial structure reinforces this. Broadway investments are all equity. There is no debt component. Investors purchase units, typically in increments of $25,000 to $50,000, and they own a proportional share of the production. If the show fails, they lose their entire investment. If it succeeds, they receive 100% of the profits until the show recoups its capitalization. And after that, profits are typically split 50-50 between investors and producers. This structure creates a fascinating alignment of incentives. Everyone, producers, investors, creative team, is in the same boat. There is no golden parachute. There is no guaranteed salary that cushions the blow of failure. The producer's reputation, the investor's capital, and the creative team's artistic legacy are all riding on the same 8 performances per week. And yet, despite these odds, people keep investing, they keep producing, they keep creating. Why? Because the emotional return on investment is real. There is something about being part of bringing a story to life, about sitting in a theater and knowing that you helped make this happen, that transcends financial calculation. Tony Award-winning producer Barbara Whitman described it perfectly when she said that production is the crossroads of commerce and creativity. It is the rare enterprise where financial success and artistic achievement are not just compatible, but interdependent. I want to close with a story that is personal to me because I think it illustrates everything we have discussed today: the framework, the intuition, the risk, the reward, and the lessons. The Outsiders. S.E. Hinton wrote The Outsiders when she was 15 years old, growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She published it in 1967, and it became one of the most beloved and widely read novels in American literature. Francis Ford Coppola adapted it into a film in 1983, featuring a cast that reads like a who's who of future Hollywood stars. The story of Ponyboy Curtis and his brothers navigating the brutal class divide between the greasers and the Socs has resonated with generations of young people who have felt like outsiders in their own world. When the opportunity to produce a musical adaptation came to me, I applied every element of the framework I have described today. The story question: does this belong on a stage? Absolutely. The Outsiders is fundamentally about community, about chosen family, about the physical and emotional violence of growing up on the wrong side of the tracks. These are themes that are amplified, not diminished, by the live theatrical experience. The vulnerability of young actors performing these roles in front of a live audience creates an immediacy that no screen can replicate. The creative team question. Danya Taymor's direction brought a raw, kinetic energy that honored the novel's urgency. Jamestown Revival's music captured the Americana soul of Oklahoma. Adam Rapp and Justin Levine's book found the emotional core of Hinton's story while making it work as a musical narrative. This was not an assembly of the most famous names in the business. This was an assembly of the right artists for this specific material. The audience question. Millions of people have read this book. Millions more have seen the film. The built-in recognition was enormous. But the question was whether a new generation, young people who may not have read the novel, would connect with the material. The answer came during previews, when we saw audiences of all ages responding with an intensity that took even us by surprise. And the longevity question. The Outsiders is a story that transcends geography and generation. It works in New York, it works in Tulsa, it works in London. It works anywhere young people feel like they do not belong, which is to say, everywhere. The show opened on April 11th, 2024, at the Bernard B. Jacobs Theater. It won 4 Tony Awards, including Best Musical and Best Direction. And in December of 2025, 20 months after opening, it recouped its $22 million investment. A North American tour launched in October of 2025, beginning in Tulsa. Productions are planned for London's West End, Asia, and Australia. I share this not to celebrate a financial outcome, though I am deeply grateful to our investors for their trust and their patience. I share it because The Outsiders represents everything I believe about producing. It started with a story that demanded to be told on a stage. It was realized by a creative team whose vision was perfectly aligned with the material. It found an audience that was hungry for exactly this kind of story, and it was built with the DNA to travel the world. That is the playbook. Not a formula, not a guarantee, but a way of thinking about the intersection of art and commerce that has guided my career. Now, I realize that most of you listening are not Broadway producers. You may never invest in a show or read a script or sit in a preview audience. But I believe the principles we have discussed today apply to every consequential decision you will ever make. Whether you are launching a business, choosing a career, investing your savings, or simply deciding how to spend your time, you are operating under uncertainty. You are making bets with incomplete information. You are balancing intuition with analysis. And you are living with the knowledge that you can do everything right and still not get the outcome you want. Here is what Broadway has taught me about making decisions under those conditions. First, know your framework. Understand what you are looking for and why. Do not make decisions based solely on excitement or fear. Ask yourself the hard questions about the opportunity, about the team, about the market, about the timing, before you commit. Second, trust your experience, but question your biases. Your intuition is valuable, but it is not infallible. The same pattern recognition that helps you spot a winner can also blind you to warning signs. Be honest with yourself about why you feel the way you feel. Third, accept that failure is not just possible, but probable. In any high-stakes endeavor, the odds are against you. That is not a reason to avoid risk. It is a reason to manage it wisely, to diversify, to learn from every outcome, and to never bet more than you can afford to lose. Fourth, look for the emotional engine. In Broadway, the shows that succeed are the ones that make people feel something they did not expect to feel. In business, the products that succeed are the ones that solve a problem people did not know they had. In life, the decisions that matter most are the ones that connect you to something larger than yourself. And fifth, and this is perhaps the most important lesson of all, surround yourself with people whose talent and vision complement your own. No producer succeeds alone. No entrepreneur succeeds alone. No one succeeds alone. The quality of your team is the single greatest predictor of your outcome. The great industry saying I opened with, "You can't make a living on Broadway, but you can make a killing," is true as far as it goes. But I would add a corollary. You cannot predict a hit, but you can create the conditions where a hit becomes possible. That is what producing is. That is what entrepreneurship is. That is what living a consequential life is. Creating the conditions for something extraordinary to happen, and then having the courage to raise the curtain. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Curtain Call Conversations. I hope I have given you a window into the world of Broadway producing that goes beyond the glamour and the Tony Awards, into the real decisions, the real risks, and the real rewards of this extraordinary profession. In our next episode, we will explore another dimension of Broadway that is rarely discussed: the global reach of American musical theater and what happens when stories born on the stages of Midtown Manhattan travel to audiences around the world. It is a conversation about cultural exchange, adaptation, and the universal language of live storytelling. Until then, I am Sue Gilad. Stay gold and stay curious.